in blue policeman's dress, gesticulating and shouting to us. He was the ward policeman, and I found him, as I did all the coloured police, able and courteous, shrewd and trusty. These police are excellent specimens of what can be made of the negro, or half-negro, if he be but first drilled, and then given a responsibility which calls out his self-respect. He was warning our crew not to run aground on one or other of the pitch reefs which here take the place of rocks. A large one, 100 yards off on the left, has been almost all dug away and carried to New York or to Paris to make asphalt pavement. The boat was run ashore, under his directions, on a spit of sand between the pitch, and when she ceased bumping up and down in the muddy surf, we scrambled out into a world exactly the hue of its inhabitants, of every shade from jet black to copper brown. The pebbles on the shore were pitch. A tide pool close by was enclosed in pitch. A Four Eyes was swimming about in it, staring up at us, and when we hunted him, tried to escape, not by diving, but by jumping on shore on the pitch and scrambling off between our legs, while the policeman, after profoundest courtesies, was gone to get a mule cart to take us up to the lake and planks to bridge its water channels. We took a look around at this oddest of corners of the earth. In front of us was the unit of civilization, the police station, wooden, on wooden stilts, as all well-built houses are here, to ensure a draught of air beneath them. We were, of course, asked to come in and sit down, but preferred looking about, under our umbrellas, for the heat was intense. The soil is half pitch, half brown earth, among which the pitch sweals in and out, as tallow sweals from a candle. It is always in slow motion under the heat of the tropic sun, and no wonder if some of the cottages have sunk right and left in such a treacherous foundation. A stone or brick house could not stand here, but wood and palm thatch are both light and tough enough to be safe, let the ground give way as it will. The soil, however, is very rich. The pitch certainly does not endure vegetation, though plants will not grow actually in it. The first plants which caught our eyes were pineapples, for which La Brea is famous. The heat of the soil as well as of the air brings them to special perfection. They grow about anywhere, unprotected by hedge or fence. For the negroes here seem honest enough, at least towards each other. And at the corner of the house was a bush worth looking at, for we had heard of it for many a year. It bore prickly, heart-shaped pods, an inch long, filled with seeds coated with a red, waxy pulp. This was a famous plant, Bixa orellana, ruku, and that pulp was the well-known Arnota dye of commerce. In England and Holland it is used merely, I believe, to colour cheeses, but in the Spanish Main to colour human beings. The Indian of the Orinoco prefers paint to clothes, and when he has ruku'd himself from head to foot, considers himself in full dress, whether for war or dancing. Doubtless he knows his own business best from long experience. Indeed, as we stood broiling on the shore, we began somewhat to regret that European manners and customs prevented our adopting the Guaraon and Arawak fashion. The mule cart arrived. The lady of the party was put into it on a chair and slowly bumped and rattled past the corner of Dundonald Street, so named after the old sea hero who was, in his lifetime, full of projects for utilising this same pitch, an upper pitch road with a pitch gutter on each side. The pitch in the road has been, most of it, laid down by hand, and is slowly working down the slight incline, leaving pools and ruts full of water, often invisible because covered with a film of brown pitch dust, and so letting in the unwary walker over his shoes. The pitch in the gutter bank is in its native place, and as it spews slowly out of the soil into the ditch in odd wreaths and lumps, we could watch, in little, the process which has produced the whole deposit, probably the whole lake itself. A bullock cart laden with pitch came jolting down past us, and we observed that the lumps, when the fracture is fresh, have all a drawn-out look, that the very air bubbles in them, which are often very numerous, are all drawn out likewise, long and oval, like the air bubbles in some ductile lavas. On our left, as we went on, the bush was low, all of yellow cassia and white hibiscus, and tangled with lovely convolvulus-like creepers, ipomia and echites with white, purple or yellow flowers. On the right were negro huts and gardens, fewer and fewer as we went on, all rich with fruit trees, especially with oranges, hung with fruit of every hue, and beneath them, of course, the pineapples of La Brea. Everywhere along the road grew, seemingly wild here, that pretty low tree, the cashew, with rounded, yellow-veined leaves and little green flowers, followed by a quaint pink and red-striped pear from which hangs, at the larger and lower end, a kidney-shaped bean which bold folk eat when roasted, but woe to those who try it when raw, for the acid oil blisters the lips, and even while the beans are roasting, the fumes of the oil will blister the cook's face if she holds it too near the fire. As we went onward up the gentle slope, the rise is 130 feet in rather more than a mile, the ground became more and more full of pitch, and the vegetation poorer and more rushy, till it resembled on the whole that of an English fen. An ipomia or two and a scarlet-flowered dwarf heliconia kept up the tropic type, as does a stiff brittle fern about 2 feet high. We picked the weeds which looked like English mint or basil, and found that most of them had 3 longitudinal nerves in each leaf, and were really melastomas, though dwarfed into a far meaner habit than that of the noble forms we saw at Chaguanas, and again on the other side of the lake. On the right, too, in a hollow, was a whole wood of gru-gru palms, grey-stemmed, grey-leaved, and here and there a patch of white or black roseau rose gracefully 8 or 10 feet high among the reeds. The plateau of pitch now widened out, and the whole ground looked like an asphalt pavement, half overgrown with marsh-loving weeds, whose roots feed in the sloppy water which overlies the pitch. But as yet there was no sign of the lake. The incline, though gentle, shuts off the view of what is beyond. This last lip of the lake has surely overflowed, and is overflowing still, though very slowly. Its furrows all curve downwards, and it is, in fact, as one of our party said, a black glacier. The pitch expanding under the burning sun of day must needs expand most towards the line of least resistance, that is, downhill. And when it contracts again under the coolness of night, it contracts, surely from the same cause, more downhill than it does uphill, and so each particle never returns to the spot whence it started, but rather drags the particles above it downward towards itself. At least so it seemed to us. Thus may be explained the common mistake which is noticed by Messrs. Wall and Sawkins in their admirable description of the lake. All previous descriptions refer the bituminous matter scattered over the La Brea district, and especially that between the village and the lake, to streams which have issued at some former epoch from the lake and extended into the sea. This supposition is totally incorrect, as solidification would have probably ensued before it had proceeded 1/10 of the distance, and such of the asphalt as has undoubtedly escaped from the lake has not advanced more than a few yards, and always presents the curved surfaces already described, and never appears as an extended sheet. Agreeing with this statement as a whole, I nevertheless cannot but think it probable that a great deal of the asphalt, whether it be in large masses or in scattered veins, may be moving very slowly downhill from lake to the sea, from the process of expansion by day and contraction by night, and may be likened to a caterpillar, or rather caterpillars innumerable, progressing by expanding and contracting their rings, having strength enough to crawl downhill, but not strength enough to crawl back up again. At last we surmounted the last rise, and before us lay the famous lake, not at the bottom of a depression as we expected, but at the top of a rise whence the ground slopes away from it on two sides and rises from it very slightly on the two others. The black pool glared and glittered in the sun. A group of islands some 20 yards wide were scattered about the middle of it. Beyond it rose a noble forest of Maurice fan palms, and to the right of them high wood with giant mombins and undergrowth of cocorite, a paradise on the other side of the Stygian pool. We walked with some misgivings onto the asphalt and found it perfectly hard. In a few yards we were stopped by a channel of clear water with tiny fish and water beetles in it, and, looking round, saw that the whole lake was intersected with channels, so unlike anything which can be seen elsewhere that it is not easy to describe them. Conceive a crowd of mushrooms of all shapes from 10 to 50 feet across, close together side by side, their tops being kept at exactly the same level, their rounded rims squeezed tight against each other, and then conceive water poured on them so as to fill the parting seams, and in the wet season, during which we visited it, to overflow the tops somewhat. Thus would each mushroom represent tolerably well one of the innumerable flat asphalt bosses, which seem to have sprung up each from a separate centre, while the parting seams would be of much the same shape as those in the asphalt. Broad and shallow atop, and rolling downward in a smooth curve till they are at bottom mere cracks from 2 to 10 feet deep. Whether these cracks actually close up below and the two contiguous masses of pitch become one cannot be seen. As far as the eye goes down, they are two, though pressed close to each other. Messrs. Wall and Sawkins explain the odd fact clearly and simply. The oil, they say, which the asphalt contains when it rises first, evaporates in the sun, of course most on the outside of the heap, leaving a tough coat of asphalt which has generally no power to unite with the corresponding coat of the next mass. Meanwhile, Mr. Manross, an American gentleman who has written a very clever and interesting account of the lake, seems to have been so far deceived by the curved and squeezed edges of these masses that he attributes to each of them a revolving motion, and supposes that the material is continually passing from the centre to the edges, when it rolls under and rises again in the middle. Certainly the strange stuff looks, at the first glance, as if it were behaving in this way, and certainly also his theory would explain the appearance of sticks and logs in the pitch. But Messrs. Wall and Sawkins say that they observed no such motion. Nor did we, and I agree with them that it is not very obvious to what force or to what influence it could be attributable. We must therefore seek for some other way of accounting for the sticks, which utterly puzzled us and which Mr. Manross well describes as numerous pieces of wood which, being involved in the pitch, are constantly coming to the surface. They are often several feet in length and 5 or 6 inches in diameter. On catching the surface, they generally assume an upright position, one end being detained in the pitch, while the other is elevated by the lifting of the middle. They may be seen at frequent intervals over the lake, standing up to the height of 2 or even 3 feet. They look like stumps of trees protruding through the pitch, but their parvenu character is curiously betrayed by a ragged cap of pitch which invariably covers the top, and hangs down like hounds' ears on either side. Whence do they come? Have they been blown onto the lake, or left behind by man? Or are they fossil trees, integral parts of the vegetable stratum below which is continually rolling upward? Or are they of both kinds? I do not know. Only this is certain, as Messrs. Wall and Sawkins have pointed out, that not only the purer varieties of asphalt, such as approach or are identical with asphalt glance, have been observed, though not, I think, in the lake itself, in isolated masses, where there was little doubt of their proceeding from ligneous substances of larger dimensions, such as roots and pieces of trunk and branches, but moreover that it is also necessary to admit a species of conversion by contact, since pieces of wood included accidentally in the asphalt, for example by dropping from overhanging vegetations, are often found partially transformed into the material. This is a statement which we verified again and again, as we did the one which follows, namely, that the hollow bubbles which abound on the surface of the pitch generally contain traces of the lighter portions of vegetation, and are manifestly derived from leaves, etc., which are blown about the lake by the wind, and are covered with asphalt, and as they become asphalt themselves, give off gases which form bubbles around them. But how is it that those logs stand up out of the asphalt with asphalt caps and hound's ears, as Mr. Manross well phrases it, on the tops of them? We pushed on across the lake over the planks which the negroes laid down from island to island. Some, meanwhile, preferred a steeplechase with water jumps, after the fashion of the midshipmen on a certain second visit to the lake. How the negroes grinned delight and surprise at the vagaries of English lads, a species of animal altogether new to them, and how they grinned still more when certain staid and portly dignitaries caught the infection and proved, by more than one good leap, that they too had been English schoolboys. Alas, long, long ago. So whether by bridging, leaping, or wading, we arrived at last at the little islands and found them covered with a thick, low scrub, deep sedge among them, penguins like huge pineapples, without the apple, grey wild pines, parasites on metapolos, which of course have established themselves, like robbers and vagrants as they are, everywhere. A true holly, with box-like leaves and a rare cocoa plum, very like the holly in habit, which seems to be all but confined to these little patches of red earth afloat on the pitch. Out of the scrub when we were there, flew off 2 or 3 nightjars, very like our English species, save that they had white in their wings, and on the second visit one of the midshipmen, true to the English boy's bird's nesting instinct, found one of their eggs white spotted in a grass nest. Passing these little islands, which are said, I know not how truly, to change their places and number, we came to the very fountains of Styx, to that part of the lake where the asphalt is still oozing up. As the wind set towards us, we soon became aware of an evil smell. Petroleum and sulphuretted hydrogen at once, which gave some of us a headache. The pitch here is yellow and white with sulphur foam. So are the water channels, and out of both water and pitch innumerable bubbles of gas arise, loathsome to the smell. We became aware also that the pitch was soft under our feet. We left the impression of our boots, and if we had stood still a while we should soon have been ankle deep. No doubt there are spots where, if a man stayed long enough, he would be slowly and horribly engulfed. But, as Mr. Manross says truly, in no place is it possible to form those bowl-like depressions around the observer described by former travellers. What we did see is that the fresh pitch oozes out of the lines of least resistance, namely, in the channels between the older and more hardened masses, usually at the upper ends of them, so that one may stand on pitch comparatively hard and put one's hands into pitch quite liquid, which is flowing softly out, like some ugly fungoid growth, such as may be seen in old wine cellars, into the water. One such pitch fungus has grown several yards in length in the 3 weeks between our first and second visit. And on another, some of our party performed exactly the same feat as Mr. Manross. In one of the star-shaped pools of water some 5 feet deep, a column of pitch has been forced perpendicularly up from the bottom. On reaching the surface of the water, it had formed a sort of centre table, about 4 feet in diameter, but without touching the sides of the pool. The stem was about 1 foot in diameter. I leapt out on this table and found that it not only sustained my weight, but the elasticity of the stem enabled me to rock it from side to side. Pieces torn from the edges of this table sank readily, showing that it had been raised by pressure and not by its buoyancy. True, though strange, but stranger still did it seem to us when we did at last what the negroes asked us, and dipped our hands into the liquid pitch to find that it did not soil the fingers. The old proverb that one cannot touch pitch without being defiled happily does not stand true here, or the place would be intolerably loathsome. It can be scraped up, moulded into any shape you will, wound in a string, as was done by one of the midshipmen, round a stick and carried off, but nothing is left on the hand save clean grey mud and water. It may be kneaded for an hour before the mud be sufficiently driven out of it to make it sticky. This very abundance of earthy matter it is which, while it keeps the pitch from soiling, makes it far less valuable than it would be were it pure. It is easy to understand whence this earthy matter, 20 or 30%, comes. Throughout the neighbourhood the ground is full to the depth of hundreds of feet of coaly and asphaltic matter. Layers of sandstone or of shale containing this decayed vegetable alternate with layers which contain none. And if, as seems probable, the coaly matter is continually changing into asphalt and oil, and then working its way upward through every crack and pore to escape from the enormous pressure of the superincumbent soil, it must needs carry up with it innumerable particles of the soils through which it passes. In 5 minutes we had seen, handled, and smelt enough to satisfy us with this very odd and very nasty vagary of tropic nature. And as we did not wish to become faint and ill between the sulphuretted hydrogen and the blaze of the sun reflected off the hot black pitch, we hurried on over the water furrows and through the sedge beds to the farther shore, to find ourselves in a single step out of an inferno into a paradiso. We looked back at the foul place and agreed that it is well for the human mind that the pitch lake was still unknown when Dante wrote that hideous poem of his, the opprobrium, as I hold, of the Middle Age. For if such were the dreams of its noblest and purest genius, what must have been the dreams of the ignoble and impure multitude? But had he seen this lake, how easy, how tempting too, it would have been to him to embody its imagery and surmise of a certain Father, and heighten the torments of the lost beings sinking slowly into the black bulge beneath the baking rays of the tropic sun, by the sight of the saved walking where we walked beneath cool, fragrant shade, among the pillars of a temple to which the Parthenon is mean and small. 60 feet and more aloft, the short smooth columns of the Maurice towered around us till, as we looked through the pillared shade, the eye was lost in the green abysses of the forest. Overhead their great fan leaves form a groined roof, compared with which that of St. Mary Redcliffe, or even of King's College, is as clumsy as all man's works are beside the works of God. And beyond the Maurice wood, ostrich plumes packed close round madder-brown stems formed a wall to our temple, which bore such tracery, carving, painting, as would have stricken dumb with awe and delight him who ornamented the loggie of the Vatican. True, all is still life here. No human forms, hardly even that of a bird, is mixed with the vegetable arabesques. A higher state of civilization, ages after we are dead, may introduce them and complete the scene by peopling it with a race worthy of it. But the Creator, at least, has done his part toward producing perfect beauty, all the more beautiful from its contrast with the ugliness outside. For the want of human beings fit for all that beauty, man is alone to blame. And when we saw approach us, as the only priest of such a temple, a wild brown man who feeds his hogs on Maurice fruit and mombin plums, and whose only object was to sell us an anteater's skin, we thought to ourselves, knowing the sad history of the West Indies, what might this place have become during the 356 years which have elapsed since Columbus first sailed round it, had men, calling themselves Christian, calling themselves civilized, possessed any tincture of real Christianity or real civilization? What a race of mingled Spaniard and Indian might have grown up throughout the West Indies. What a life, what a society, what an art, what a science it might have developed ere now, equalling, even surpassing that of Ionia, Athens and Sicily, till the famed isles and coasts of Greece should have been almost forgotten in the new fame of the isles and coasts of the Caribbean Sea. What might not have happened had men but tried to copy their Father in heaven? What has happened is but too well known, since in July 1498 Columbus, coming hither, fancied, and not so wrongly, that he had come to the base of the earthly paradise. What might not have been made with something of justice and mercy, common sense and humanity, of those gentle Arawaks and Guarons? What was made of them almost ere Columbus was dead may be judged from this one story taken from Las Casas. There was a certain man named Juan Bono, who was employed by the members of the Audiencia of St. Domingo to go and obtain Indians. He and his men, to the number of 50 or 60, landed on the island of Trinidad. Now the Indians of Trinidad were a mild, loving, credulous race, the enemies of the Caribs, who ate human flesh. On Juan Bono's landing, the Indians, armed with bows and arrows, went to meet the Spaniards and to ask them who they were and what they wanted. Juan Bono replied that his crew were good and peaceful people who had come to live with the Indians, upon which, as the commencement of good fellowship, the natives offered to build houses for the Spaniards. The Spanish captain expressed a wish to have one large house built. The accommodating Indians set about building it. It was to be in the form of a bell, and to be large enough for 100 persons to live in. On any great occasion it would hold many more. Every day while this house was being built, the Spaniards were fed with fish, bread, and fruit by their good-natured hosts. Juan Bono was very anxious to see the roof on, and the Indians continued to work at the building with alacrity. At last it was completed, being 2 stories high, and so constructed that those within could not see those without. Upon a certain day, Juan Bono collected the Indians together, men, women, and children, in the building, to see, as he told them, what was to be done. Whether they thought they were coming to some festival or that they were to do something more for the general house does not appear. However, there they all were, 400 of them, looking with much delight at their own handiwork. Meanwhile, Juan Bono brought his men round the building, with drawn swords in their hands. Then, having thoroughly entrapped his Indian friends, he entered with a party of armed men and bade the Indians keep still, or he would kill them. They did not listen to him, but rushed to the door. A horrible massacre ensued. Some of the Indians forced their way out, but many of them, stupefied by what they saw and losing heart, were captured and bound. 100, however, escaped, and snatching up their arms, assembled in one of their own houses and prepared to defend themselves. Juan Bono summoned them to surrender. They would not hear of it, and then, as Las Casas says, he resolved to pay them completely for the hospitality and kind treatment he had received, and so, setting fire to the house, the whole 100 men, together with some women and children, were burnt alive. The Spanish captain and his men retired to the ships with their captives, and his vessel, happening to touch at Puerto Rico when the Geronimite fathers were there, gave occasion to Las Casas to complain of this proceeding to the fathers, who, however, did nothing in the way of remedy or punishment. The reader will be surprised to hear of Clerigo's authority for this deplorable narrative. It is Juan Bono himself. From his own mouth I heard that which I write. Juan Bono acknowledged that never in his life had he met with the kindness of father or mother, but in the island of Trinidad. Well then, man of perdition, why did you reward them with such ungrateful wickedness and cruelty? On my faith, Padre, because they, he meant the auditors, gave me for destruction, he meant instruction, to take them in peace if I could not by war. Such was the fate of the poor gentlefolk who for unknown ages had swung their hammocks to the stems of these maurices, spinning the skin of the young leaves into twine and making sago from the pith, and then wine from the sap and fruit, while they warned their children not to touch the nests of the hummingbirds, which even till lately swarmed around the lake. For, so the Indian story ran, once on a time a tribe of Chamas built their palm-leaf ajupas upon the very spot where the lake now lies, and lived a merry life. The sea swarmed with shellfish and turtle, and the land with pineapples. The springs were haunted by countless flocks of flamingos and horned screamers, pajuis and blue ramiers, and above all by hummingbirds. But the foolish Chamas were blind to the mystery and the beauty of the hummingbirds, and would not understand how they were no other than the souls of dead Indians, translated into living jewels, and so they killed them in wantonness and angered the good spirit. But one morning when the Guarayans came by, the Chama village had sunk deep into the earth, and in its place had risen this lake of pitch. So runs the tale told some 40 years since San Josef, author of a clever little history of Trinidad, by an old half-caste Indian, Senor Trinidada, by name, who was said then to be nigh 100 years of age. Surely the people among whom such a myth could spring up were worthy of a nobler fate. Surely there were in them elements of sweetness and light, which might have been cultivated to some fine fruit, had there been anything like sweetness and light in their first conquerors. The offscourings not of Spain and Portugal only, but of Germany, Italy, and indeed almost every country in Europe. The present Spanish landowners of Trinidad, be it remembered always, do not derive from these old ruffians, but from noble and ancient families who settled in the island during the 17th century, bringing with them a Spanish grace, Spanish simplicity and Spanish hospitality, which their descendants certainly have not lost. Were it my habit to put people into books, I would gladly tell in these pages of charming days spent in the company of Spanish ladies and gentlemen. But I shall only hint here at the special affection and respect with which they, and indeed the French Creoles likewise, are regarded by Negro and by Indians. For there are a few Indians remaining in the northern mountains, and especially at Arima, simple hamlet folk whom you can distinguish at a glance from mulattoes or quadroons, by the tawny complexion, and by a shape of eye and length between the eye and the mouth, difficult to draw, impossible to describe, but discerned instantly by anyone accustomed to observe human features. Many of them, doubtless, have some touch of Negro blood, and are the offspring of Cimarrons, Maroons, as they are still called in Jamaica. These Cimarrons were Negroes who, even in the latter half of the 16th century, as may be read in the tragical tale of John Oxenham, given in Hakluyt's Voyages, had begun to flee from their cruel masters into the forest, both in the islands and in the main. There they took to themselves Indian wives, who preferred them, it is said, to men of their own race, and lived a jolly hunter's life, slaying with tortures every Spaniard who fell into their hands. Such, doubtless, haunted the northern Cheras of Tocuche, Aripo, and Arapuche, and left some trace of themselves among the Guarayans. Spanish blood, too, runs notoriously in the veins of some of the Indians of the island, and the pure race here is all but vanished. But out of these three elements has arisen a race of cocoa-growing mountaineers, as simple and gentle, as loyal and peaceable as any in Her Majesty's dominions. Dignified, courteous, hospitable, according to their little means, they salute the white seigneur without defiance and without servility, and are delighted if he will sit in their clay and Parma jupas and eat oranges and Malacca apples from their own trees on their own freehold land. They preserve, too, the old Guarean arts of weaving baskets and other utensils, pretty enough, from the strips of the aruma leaves. From them the Negro, who will not or cannot equal them in handicraft, buys the pack in which the wares are carried on their back, and the curious strainer in which the cassava is deprived of its poisonous juice. So cleverly are the fibres twisted that when the strainer is hung up with a stone weight at the lower end, the diameter of the strainer decreases as its length increases, and the juice is squeezed out through the pores to drip into a calabash, and nowadays to be thrown carefully away, lest children or goats should drink it. Of old it was kept with care and dried down to a gum, and used to poison arrows, as it is still used, I believe, in the Orinoco. Now its poisonous properties are expelled by boiling it down into cassaripe, which has a singular power of preserving meat and is the foundation of the pepper pot of the colonists. And this is all that remains of the once beautiful, deft and happy Indians of Trinidad, unless indeed some of them, warned by the fate of the Indians of San Josef and the northern mountains, fled from such tyrants as Juan Bono and Berreo across the Gulf of Paria, and rejoining their kinsmen on the mainland, gladly forgot the sight of that cross which was to them the emblem, not of salvation, but of destruction. For once a year, till of late, I know not whether the thing may be seen still, a strange phantom used to appear at San Fernando, 20 miles to the north. Canoes of Indians came mysteriously across the Gulf of Paria from the vast swamps of the Orinoco, and the naked folk landed and went up through the town after the Naporima ladies, so runs the tale, had sent down to the shore garments for the women, which were worn only through the streets and laid by again as soon as they entered the forest. Silent, modest, dejected, the gentle savages used to vanish into the woods by path known to the kinsfolk centuries ago, paths which run, wherever possible, along the vantage ground of the topmost chines and ridges of the hills. The smoke of their fires rose out of lonely glens as they collected the fruit of trees known only to themselves. In a few weeks their wild harvest was over. They came back through San Fernando, made almost in silence their little purchases in the town, and paddled away across the gulf towards the unknown wildernesses from whence they came. And now, as if sent to drive away sad thoughts and vain regrets, before our feet lay a jest of nature's, almost as absurd as a four-eyed fish or calling crab. A rough stick of the size of your little finger lay on the pitch. We watched it a moment and saw that it was crawling, that it was a huge caddis, like those in English ponds and streams, though of a very different family. They are the larvae of Phryganias, this of a true moth. The male of this moth will come out as a moth should, and fly about on 4 handsome wings. The female will never develop her wings, but remain to her life's end a crawling grub, like the female of our own vapour moth, and that of our English glowworm. But more, she will never, at least in some species of this family, leave her silk and bark case, but live and die an anchoretess in narrow cell, leaving behind her more than one puzzle for physiologists. The case is fitted close to the body of the caterpillar, save at the mouth, where it hangs loose in two ragged silken curtains. We all looked at the creature, and it looked at us with its last 2 or 3 joints and its head thrust out of its house. Suddenly, disgusted at our importunity, it laid hold of its curtains with 2 hands, right and left, like a human being, folded them modestly over its head, held them tight together, and so retired to bed, amidst the indistinguishable laughter of the whole party. The noble Maurice palm delights in wet, at least in Trinidad and on the lower Orinoco, but Schomburgk describes forests of them, if indeed it be the same species, as growing in the mountains of Guyana up to an altitude of 4,000 feet. The soil in which they grow here is half pitch pavement, half loose brown earth, and over both shallow pools of water which will become much deeper in the wet season, and all about float or lie their pretty fruit, the size of an apple and scaled like a fir cone. They are last years, empty and decayed. The ripe fruit contains first a rich pulpy nut, and at last a hard cone, something like that of the vegetable ivory palm, which grows in the mainland, but not here. Delicious they are, and precious to monkeys and parrots as well as the Orinoco Indians, among whom the Tamanacs, according to Humboldt, say that when a man and woman survived that great deluge, which the Mexicans call the Age of Water, they cast behind them over their heads the fruits of the Maurice palm, as Deucalion and Pyrrha cast stones, and saw the seeds in them produce men and women who repeopled the earth. No wonder indeed that certain tribes look on this tree as sacred, or that the missionaries should have named it the Tree of Life. In the season of inundations, these clumps of Mauritia, with only their leaves in the form of a fan, have the appearance of a forest rising from the bosom of the waters. The navigator, in proceeding along the channels of the delta of the Orinoco at night, sees with surprise the summit of the palm trees illuminated by large fires. These are the habitations of the Guaraons, Tivitivus and Warrawettes of Raleigh, which are suspended from the trunks of the trees. These tribes hang up mats in the air which they fill with earth, and kindle on a layer of moist clay the fire necessary for their household wants. They have owned their liberty and their political independence for ages, to the quaking and swampy soil, which they pass over in the time of drought, and on which they alone know how to walk in security to their solitude in the delta of the Orinoco, to their abode on the trees, where religious enthusiasm will probably never lead any American stylites. The Mauritia palm tree, the tree of life of the missionaries, not only affords the Guaraons a safe dwelling during the risings of the Orinoco, but its shelly fruit, its farinaceous pith, its juice abounding in saccharine matter, and the fibres of its petioles furnish them with food, wine, and thread proper for making cords and weaving hammocks. These customs of the Indians of the delta of the Orinoco were found formerly in the Gulf of Darien, Uraba, and in the greater part of the inundated lands between the Guarapiche and the mouths of the Amazon. It is curious to observe in the lowest degree of human civilization the existence of a whole tribe depending on one single species of palm tree, similar to those insects which feed on one and the same flower or on one and the same part of a plant. In 100 yards more we were on dry ground, and the vegetation changed at once. The Mauritius stopped short at the edge of the swamp, and around us towered the smooth stems of giant mombims, which the English West Indies call hogplums, according to the unfortunate habit of the early settlers of discarding the sonorous and graceful Indian and Spanish names of the plants and replacing them by names English or corruptions of the original, always ugly and often silly and vulgar. So the English call yon noble tree a hogplum. The botanist, who must of course use his worldwide Latin designation, Spondius lutea, I shall, with the reader's leave, call it a mombin, by which name it is happily known here, as it was in the French West Indies in the days of good Père Labat. Under the mombims the undergrowth is, for the most part, huge fans of cocorite palm, 30 or 40 feet high, their short, rugged trunks, as usual, loaded with creepers, orchids, birds' nests, and huge round black lumps, which are the nest of ants, all lodged among the butts of old leaves and the spathes of old flowers. Here, as at Chaguanas, grand ceremons and seguins scrambled 20 feet up the cocorite trunks, delighting us by the luscious life in the fat stem and fat leaves and the brilliant yet tender green, which literally shone in the darkness of the cocorite bower, and all, it may be, the growth of the last 6 months. For, as was plain from the charred stems of many cocorite and Mauritius, the fire had swept through the wood last summer, destroying all that would burn. And at the foot of the cockorites, weltering up among and over the roots, was pitch again, and here and there along the side of the path were pitch springs, round bosses a yard or two across and a foot or two high, each with a crater atop a few inches across, filled either with water or with liquid and oozing pitch, and yet not interfering, as far as could be seen, with the health of the vegetation which springs out of it. We followed the trace which led downhill to the shore of the peninsula farthest from the village. As we proceeded, we entered forests still unburnt, and a tangle of beauty such as we saw at Chaguanas. There rose once more the tall, cane-like manac palms, which we christened the forest nymphs. The path was lined, as there, with the great leaves of the melastomas, throwing russet and golden light down from their undersides. Here, as there, mimosa leaflets, as fine as fern or seaweed, shiver in the breeze. A species of balisier, which we did not see there, carried crimson and black parrot beaks with blue seed vessels. A canne de rivière, with a stem 8 feet high, wreathed round with pale green leaves in spiral twists, unfolded hooded flowers of thinnest transparent white wax, with each a blush of pink inside. Bunches of bright yellow cassia blossoms dangled close to our heads. White epomeus scrambled over them again, and broad-leaved sedges 5 feet high, carrying on bright brown flower heads like those of our wood rush, blue, black and white shot for seeds. Overhead sprawled and dangled the common vine bamboo, ugly and unsatisfactory in form because it has not yet seemingly made up its mind whether it will become an arborescent or a climbing grass, and meanwhile tries to stand upright on stems quite unable to support it, and tumbles helplessly into the neighbouring copsewood, taking everyone's arms without asking leave. A few ages hence, its ablest descendants will probably have made their choice, if they have constitution enough to survive in the battle of life, which, from the commonness of the plant, they seem likely to have. And what their choice will be, there is little doubt. There are trees here of a truly noble nature, whose ancestors have conquered ages since. It may be by selfish and questionable means, but their descendants, secure in their own power, can afford to be generous and allow a whole world of lesser plants to nestle in their branches, another world to fatten round their feet. There are humble and modest plants too here, and those some of the loveliest, which have long since cast away all ambition, and are content to crouch or perch anywhere, if only they may be allowed a chance ray of light and a chance drop of water wherewith to perfect their flowers and seed. But throughout the great republic of the forest, the motto of the majority is, as it is and always has been with human beings, everyone for himself, and the devil take the hindmost. Selfish competition, overreaching tyranny, the temper which fawns and clings as long as it is down, and when it has risen, kicks over the stool by which it climbed. These and the other works of the flesh are the works of the average plant as far as it can practice them. So by the time the bamboo vine makes up its mind, it will have discovered by the experience of many generations the value of the proverb, never do for yourself what you can get another to do for you, and will have developed into a true high climber, selfish and insolent, choking and strangling like yonder beautiful green pest, of which beware, namely a tangle of razor grass, the brother in old times of that broad-leafed sedge, which carries the shot seeds. It has long since found it more profitable to lean on others than to stand on its own legs, and has developed itself accordingly. It has climbed up the shrub some 15 feet and is now tumbling down again in masses of the purest deep green, which are always softly rounded, because each slender leaf is sabre-shaped and always curves inwards and downwards into the mass, presenting to the paper thousands of minute saw edges, hard enough and sharp enough to cut, clothe skin and flesh to ribbons, if it is brushed in the direction of the leaves. For shape and colour, few plants would look more lovely in a hothouse, but it would soon need to be confined in a den by itself, like a jaguar or an alligator. Here too we saw a beautiful object, which was seen again more than once about the high woods. A large flower spreading its 5 flat orange-scarlet lobes round yellow bells. It grew in little bunches, and the axils and pairs of fleshy leaves on a climbing vine. When plucked, a milky sap exudes from it. It is a cousin of our periwinkles, and cousin too of the Thevechia, which we saw in St. Thomas's, and of the yellow alamanders, which ornament hothouses at home. As this and others of its family, especially the yellow odontodenia, surely ought to do. There are many species of the family about, and all beautiful. We passed too, in the path, an object curious enough, if not beautiful. Up a smooth stem ran a little rib, seemingly of earth and dead wood, almost straight, and about half an inch across, leading to a great brown lump among the branches, as big as a bushel basket. We broke it open and found it a covered gallery swarming with life. Brown ant-like creatures, white maggot-like creatures, of several shapes and sizes, were hurrying up and down, as busy as human beings in Cheapside. They were termites, white ants, of which of the many species I know not, and the lump above was their nest. But why they should find it wisest to perch their nest aloft is as difficult to guess as to guess why they take the trouble to build this gallery up to it, instead of walking up the stem in the open air. It may be that they are afraid of birds. It may be, too, that they actually dislike the light. At all events, the majority of them, the workers and soldiers, I believe, without exception, are blind and do all their work by an intensely developed sense of touch, and it may be of smell and hearing also. Be that as it may, we should have seen them, had we had time to wait, repair the breach in their gallery, with as much discipline and division of labour as average human workers in a manufactory, before the business of food getting was resumed. We hurried on along the trace, which now sloped rapidly downhill. Suddenly, a loathsome smell defiled the air. Was there a gas house in the wilderness, or had the pails of paradise been just smeared with bad coal tar? Not exactly, but across the path crept, festering in the sun, a black runnel of petroleum and water, and 20 yards to our left stood, under a fast crumbling trunk, what was a year or two ago a little engine house. Now roof, beams, machinery were all tumbled and tangled in a hideous and somewhat dangerous ruin over a shaft in the midst of which a rusty pump cylinder gurgled and clicked and bubbled and spewed with black oil and nasty gas. A foul ulcer in Dame Nature's side, which happily was healing fast beneath the tropic rain and sun. The creepers were climbing over it, the earth crumbling into it, and a few years more the whole would be engulfed in forest, and the oil spring, it is to be hoped, choked up with mud. This is the remnant of one of the many rash speculations connected with the Pitch Lake. At a depth of some 250 feet, oil was struck, as the American saying is. But, so we are told, it would not rise in the boring, and had to be pumped up. It could not, therefore, compete in price with the Pennsylvanian oil, which, when tapped, springs out of the ground of itself to a height sometimes of many feet, under the pressure of the superincumbent rocks, yielding enormous profits and turning needy adventurers into millionaires, though full half of the oil is sometimes wasted for the want of means to secure it. We passed the doleful spot with a double regret, for the nook of paradise which had been defiled and for the good money which had been wasted, but with a hearty hope, too, that, whatever natural beauty may be spoiled thereby, the wealth of these asphalt deposits may at last be utilized. Whether it be good that a few dozen men should make their fortunes thereby depends on what use the said men make of the said fortunes, and certainly it will not be good for them if they believe, as too many do, that their dollars and not their characters constitute their fortunes. But it is good and must be that these treasures of heat and light should not remain forever locked up and idle in the wilderness, and we wished all success to the enterprising Americans who had just completed a bargain with the government for a large supply of asphalt, which he hoped by his chemical knowledge to turn to some profitable cause. Another turn brought us into a fresh nook of paradise, and this time to one still undefiled. We hurried down a narrow gas path, the Cannes de Rivière and the Balisiers brushing our heads as we passed, while around us danced brilliant butterflies, bright orange, sulphur yellow, black and crimson, black and lilac, and a half-dozen hues more, till we stopped, surprised and delighted, for beneath us lay the sea, seen through a narrow gap of richest verdure. On the left, low palms feathered over the path, and over the cliff. On the right, when shall we see it again, rose a young bois flot, of which boys making their fishing floats with long, straight, upright shoots, and huge crumpled, rounded leaves, pale rusty underneath. A noble rastrillo plant, already in its 6 months' growth, some 20 feet high, its broad, pale sulphur flowers were yet unopened. But instead, an ivy-leaf ipomea had climbed up it, and shrouded it from head to foot with hundreds of white convolvulus flowers, while underneath it grew a tuft of that delicate silver-backed fern which is admired so much in hothouses at home. Between it and the palms we saw the still, shining sea, muddy inshore, and a few hundred yards out, changing suddenly to bright green, and the point of the cove, which seemed built up of bright red brick, fast crumbling into the sea with all its palms and cactuses, lianes and trees. Red stacks and skerries stood isolated and ready to fall at the end of the point, showing that the land has, even lately, extended far out to sea, and that Point Rouge, like Point Corbaril, and Point Galba, so named, one from some great locust tree, the other from some great galba, must have once stood there as landmarks. Indeed, all the points of the peninsula are but remnants of a far larger sheet of land, which has been slowly eaten up by the surges of the Gulf, which has perhaps actually sunk bodily beneath them, even as the remnant, I suspect, is sinking now. We scrambled 20 feet down to the beach and lay down tired under a low cliff, feathered with rich vegetation. The pebbles on which we sat were some of pitch, some of hard sandstone, but most of them of brick. Pale, dark, yellow, lavender, spotted, clouded, and half a dozen more delicate hues. Some coarse, some fine as Samian ware. The rocks themselves were composed of an almost glassy substance, strangely jumbled, even intercalated now and then with soft sand. This, we were told, is a bit of the porcelainite formation of Trinidad, curious to geologists, which reappears at several points in Erin, Troyes and Cedros, in the extreme southwest horn of the island. How was it formed, and when? That it was formed by the action of fire, any child would agree who had ever seen a brick kiln. It is simply clay and sand baked, and often almost vitrified into porcelain jasper. The stratification is gone. The porcelainite has run together into irregular masses or fallen into them by the burning away of strata beneath, and the cracks in it are often lined with bubbled slag. But whence came the fire? We must be wary about calling in the deus ex machina of a volcano. There is no volcanic rock in the neighbourhood, or anywhere in the island, and the porcelainite, says Mr. Wall, is identically the same with the substances produced immediately above or below seams of coal, which have taken fire and burnt for a length of time. There is lignite and other coaly matter enough in the rocks to have burnt like coal, if it had once been ignited, and the cause of the ignition may be, as Mr. Wall suggests, the decomposition of pyrites, of which also there is enough around. That the heat did not come from below as volcanic heat would have done is proved by the fact that the lignite beds underneath the porcelainite are unburnt. We found asphalt under the porcelainite, We found even one bit of red porcelainite with unburnt asphalt included in it. May not this strange formation of natural brick and chinaware be of immense age, humanly, not geologically speaking? May it not be far older than the pitch lake above, older possibly than the formation of any asphalt at all? And may not the asphalt mingled with it have been squeezed into it and round it, as it is being squeezed into and through the unburnt strata at so many points in Guapo, La Brea, Orapuchi and San Fernando? At least so it seemed to us, as we sat on the shore waiting for the boat to take us round to La Brea, and drank in dreamily with our eyes the beauty of that strange, lonely place. The only living things, save ourselves, which were visible were a few pelicans sleeping on a skerry, and a shoal of dolphins rolling silently in threes, husband, wife, and little child, as they fished their way along the tide mark between the yellow water and the green. The sky blazed overhead, the sea below, the red rocks and green forests blazed around, and we sat enjoying the genial silence, not of darkness, but of light, not of death, but of life, as the noble heat permeated every nerve, and made us feel young and strong and blithe once more. Chapter 9, San Josef. The road to the ancient capital of the island is pleasant enough, and characteristic of the West Indies. Not indeed as to its breadth, make, and material, for they, contrary to the want of West India roads, are as good as they would be in England, but on account of the quaint travellers along it, and the quaint sights which are to be seen over every hedge. You pass all the races of the island going to and from town or field work, or washing clothes in some clear brook, beside which a solemn Chinaman sits catching for his dinner strange fishes, known to my learned friend Dr. Gunther, and perhaps to one or two other men in Europe, but certainly not to me. Always somebody or something new and strange is to be seen, for 8 most pleasant miles. The road runs at first along a low cliff foot, with an ugly mangrove swamp, looking just like an alder bed at home, between you and the sea. A swamp which it would be worthwhile to drain by a steam pump, and then plant with coconuts or bamboos, for its miasma makes the southern corner of Port of Spain utterly pestilential. You cross a railroad, the only one in the island, which goes to a limestone quarry, and so out along a wide stretch of road, with negro cottages right and left, embowered in fruit and flowers. They grow fewer and finer as you ride on, and soon you are in open country, principally of large paddocks. These paddocks, like all West Indian ones, are apt to be ragged with weeds and scrub. But the coarse broad-leaved grasses seem to keep the mules in good condition enough, at least in the rainy season. Most of these paddocks have, I believe, been under cane cultivation at some time or other, and have been thrown into grass during the period of depression dating from 1845. It has not been worth while as yet to break them up again, though the profits of the sugar farming are now, or at least ought to be, very large. But the soil along this line is originally poor and sandy, and it is far more profitable to break up the rich Vegas or low alluvial lands, even at the trouble of clearing them of forest. So these paddocks are left, often with noble trees standing about in them, putting one in mind, if it were not for the palmistes and the bamboos and the crowd of black vultures over an occasional dead animal, of English parks. But few English parks have such backgrounds. To the right, the vast southern flat, with its smoking engine-house chimneys and bright green cane pieces. And, beyond all, the black wall of the primeval forest. And to the left, some half-mile off, the steep slopes of the green northern mountains, blazing in the sun and sending down every 2 or 3 miles, out of some charming glen, a clear, pebbly brook, each winding through its narrow strip of vega. The vega is usually a highly cultivated cane piece, where great lizards sit in the mouths of their burrows and watch the passer-by with intense interest. Coolies and negroes are at work in it, but only a few, for the strength of the hands is away at the engine-house making sugar day and night. There is a piece of cane in act of being cut. The men are hewing down the giant grass with cutlasses, the women stripping off the leaves and then piling the cane in carts drawn by mules, the leaders of which draw by rope traces 2 or 3 times as long as themselves. You wonder why such a seeming waste of power is allowed, till you see one of the carts stick fast in a mud-hole, and discover that even in the West Indies there is a good reason for everything, and that the Creoles know their own business best. For the wheelers, being in the slough with the cart, are powerless, but the leaders who have scrambled through are safe on dry land at the end of their long traces, and haul out their brethren, cart and all, amid the yells, and I'm sorry to say blows, of the black gentlemen in attendance. But cane-cutting is altogether a busy, happy scene. The heat is awful, and all limbs rain perspiration. Yet no one seems to mind the heat. All look fat and jolly, and they have cause to do so, for all at every spare moment are sucking sugar-cane. You pull up and take off your hat to the party. The negroes shout, "Morning, sir." The coolies salaam gracefully, hand to forehead. You return the salaam hand to heart, which is considered the correct thing on the part of a superior in rank, whereat the coolies look exceedingly pleased, and then the whole party, without visible reason, burst into shouts of laughter. The manager rides up, probably under an umbrella as you are, and a pleasant and instructive chat follows, wound up usually, if the house be not far off, by an invitation to come in and have a light drink, an invitation which, considering the state of the thermometer, you will be tempted to accept, especially as you know that the claret and water will be excellent. And so you dawdle on, looking at this and that, new and odd sight, but most of all feasting your eyes on the beauty of the northern mountains, till you reach the gentle rise on which stands, 8 miles from Port of Spain, the little city of San Josef. We should call it, here in England, a village. Still, it is not every village in England which has fought the Dutch and earned its right to be called a city by beating some of the bravest sailors of the 17th century. True, there is not a single shop in it with a plate-glass window, but what matters that if its citizens have all that civilized people need, and more, and will heap what they have on the stranger so hospitably that they almost pain him by the trouble which they take. True, no carriages and pairs with powdered footmen roll about the streets, and most splendid vehicles you are likely to meet are American buggies, 4-wheeled gigs with heads, and aprons through which the reins can be passed in wet weather. But what matters that, as long as the buggies keep out the sun and rain effectually, and as long as those who sit in them be real gentlemen, and those who wait for them at home, whether in the city or the estates around, be real ladies. As for the rest, peace, plenty, perpetual summer, time to think and read, for there are no daily papers in San Josef. And what can man want more on earth? So I thought more than once as I looked at San Josef nestling at the mouth of its noble glen, and said to myself, if the telegraph cable were but laid down the islands, as it will be in another year or two, and one could hear a little more swiftly and loudly the beating of the great mother's heart at home, then would San Josef be about the most delectable spot which I have ever seen for a cultivated and civilized man to live and work and think and die in. San Josef has had nevertheless its troubles and excitements more than once since it defeated the Dutch. Even as late as 1837 it was, for a few hours, in utter terror and danger from a mutiny of free black recruits. No one in the island, civil or military, seems to have been to blame for the mishap. It was altogether owing to the unwisdom of military authorities at home, who seem to have fancied that they could transform by a magical spurt of the pen heathen savages into British soldiers. The whole tragedy, for tragedy it was, is so curious and so illustrative of the Negro character and of the effects of the slave trade, that I shall give it at length as it stands in the clever little history of Trinidad by Monsieur Thomas, which I have quoted more than once. Donald Stewart, or rather Daga, was the adopted son of Madashi, the old and childless king of the tribe called Paw-Paws, a race that inhabit a tract of country bordering on that of Yarrabas. These races are constantly at war with each other. Daga was just the man whom a savage, warlike and depredatory tribe would select for their chieftain, as the African Negroes choose their leaders with reference to their personal prowess. Daga stood 6 feet 6 inches without shoes. Although scarcely muscular in proportion, yet his frame indicated in a singular degree the union of irresistible strength and activity. His head was large. His features had all the peculiar traits which distinguish the Negro in a remarkable degree. His jaw was long, eyes large and protruded, high cheekbones and flat nose. His teeth were large and regular. He had a single cast in his eyes, not quite amounting to that obliquity of the visual organs denominated a squint, but sufficient to give his features a peculiarly forbidding appearance. His forehead, however, although small in proportion to his enormous head, was remarkably compact and well formed. The whole head was disproportioned, having the greater part of the brain behind the ears, but the greatest peculiarity of this singular being was his voice. In the course of my life I never heard such sounds uttered by human organs as those formed by Daga. In ordinary conversation he appeared to me to endeavour to soften his voice. It was a deep tenor, but when a little excited by any passion, and this savage was the child of passion, his voice sounded like the low growl of a lion. But when much excited, it could be compared to nothing so aptly as the notes of a gigantic brazen trumpet. I repeatedly questioned this man respecting the religion of his tribe. The result of his answers led me to infer that the Paw-Paws believed in the existence of a future state, that they have a confused notion of several powers, good and evil, but those are ruled by one supreme being called Hololu. This amount of the religion of Daga was confirmed by the military chaplain who attended him in his last moments. He also informed me that he believed in predestination. At least, he said that Hololu, he knew, had ordained that he should come to white man's country and to be shot. Daga having made a successful predatory expedition into the country of the Yarabas, returned with a number of prisoners of that nation. These he as usual took bound and guarded towards the coast to sell to the Portuguese. The interpreter, his countryman, called these Portuguese white gentlemen. The white gentlemen proved themselves more than a match for the black gentlemen, and the whole transaction between the Portuguese and the Paupous does credit to all concerned in this gentlemanly traffic in human flesh. Darga sold his prisoners, and under pretence of paying him, he and his Paupou guards were enticed on board a Portuguese vessel. They were treacherously overpowered by the Christians, who bound them beside their late prisoners, and the vessel sailed over the great salt water. This transaction caused in the breast of the savage a deep hatred against all white men, a hatred so intense that he frequently, during and subsequent to the mutiny, declared he would eat the first white man he killed. Yet this cannibal was made to swear allegiance to our sovereign on the holy evangelists, and was then called a British soldier. On the voyage, the vessel on board which Darga had been entrapped was captured by the British. He could not comprehend that his new captors liberated him. He had been overreached and trepanned by one set of white men, and he naturally looked on his second captors as more successful rivals in the human, or rather inhuman, Guinea trade. Therefore, this event lessened not his hatred for white men in the abstract. I was informed by several of the Africans who came with him that when, during the voyage, they upbraided Darga with being the cause of their capture, he pacified them by promising that when they should arrive in the white man's country, he would repay their perfidy by attacking them in the night. He further promised that if the Paupous and the Yarabas would follow him, he would fight his way back to Guinea. This account was fully corroborated by many of the mutineers, especially those who were shot with Darga. They all said the revolt never would have happened but for Donald Stewart, as he was called by the officers, but Africans who were not of his tribe called him Longa Longa on account of his height. Such was this extraordinary man who led the mutiny I am about to relate. A quantity of captured Africans having been brought hither from the islands of Grenada and Dominica, they were most imprudently induced to enlist as recruits in the 1st West India Regiment. True it is, we have been told they did this voluntarily. But it may be asked, if they had any will in the matter, how could they understand the duties to be imposed on them by becoming soldiers, or how comprehend the nature of an oath of allegiance, without which they could not, legally speaking, be considered as soldiers? I attended the whole of the trials of these men, and well know how difficult it was to make them comprehend any idea which was at all new to them by means of the best interpreters procurable. It has been said that by making those captured Negroes soldiers, a service was rendered them. This I doubt. Formerly, it was most true that a soldier in a black regiment was better off than a slave. But certainly a free African in the West Indies now is infinitely in a better situation than a soldier, not only in a pecuniary point of view, but in almost every other respect. To the African savage, while being drilled into the duties of a soldier, many things seem absolute tyranny which would appear to a civilized man a mere necessary restraint. To keep the restless body of an African Negro in a position to which he has not been accustomed, to cramp his splay feet with his great toes standing out into European shoes made for feet of a different form, to place a collar round his neck, which is called a stock, and which to him is cruel torture. Above all, to confine him every night to his barracks, are almost insupportable. One unacquainted with the habits of the Negro cannot conceive with what abhorrence he looks on having his disposition to nocturnal rambles checked by barrack regulations. Formerly the King's man, as the black soldier loved to call himself, looked, not without reason, contemptuously on the planter's slave, although he himself was after all but a slave to the state. But these recruits were enlisted shortly after a number of their recently imported countrymen were wandering freely over the country, working either as free labourers or settling, to use an apt American phrase, as squatters, and to assert that the recruit, while under military probation, is better off than the free Trinidad labourer, who goes where he lists and earns as much in one day as will keep him for 3 days, is an absurdity. Accordingly, we find that Lieutenant Colonel Bush, who commanded the 1st West India Regiment, thought that the mutiny was mainly owing to the ill advice of their civil, or we should rather say, unmilitary countrymen. This to a certain degree was the fact, but by the declaration of Daga and many of his countrymen, it is evident the seeds of mutiny were sown on the passage from Africa. It has been asserted that the recruits were driven to mutiny by hard treatment of their commanding officers. There seems not the slightest truth in this assertion. They were treated with fully as much kindness as their situation would admit of, and their chief was peculiarly a favourite of Colonel Bush and the officers, notwithstanding Daga's violent and ferocious temper often caused complaints to be brought against him. A correspondent of the Naval and Military Gazette was under an apprehension that the mutineers would be joined by predial apprentices of the circumjacent estates. Not the slightest foundation existed for this apprehension. Some months previous to this, Daga had planned a mutiny, but this was interrupted by sending a part of the Paupau and Yaraba recruits to St. Lucia. The object of all those conspiracies was to get back to Guinea, which they thought they could accomplish by marching to eastward. On the night of the 17th of June, 1837, the people of San Josef were kept awake by the recruits, about 280 in number, singing a war song of the Paupaus. This wild song consisted of a short air and chorus. The tone was, although wild, not unharmonious, and the words rather euphonious. As near as our alphabet can convey them, they ran thus: Dankare, Ofe, Oluwarei, Ole, which may be rendered almost literally by the following couplet: Air by the chief, come to plunder, come to slay. Chorus of the followers: we are ready to obey. About 3 o'clock in the morning, their war song, highly characteristic of a predatory tribe, became very loud, and they commenced uttering their war cries. This is different from what we conceive the Indian war whoop to be. It seemed to be a kind of imitation of the growl of wild beasts, and has a most thrilling effect. Fire now was set to a quantity of huts built for the accommodation of African soldiers to the northwards of the barracks, as well as to the house of a poor black woman called Dalrymple. These burnt briskly, throwing a dismal glare over the barracks and picturesque town of San Josef, and overpowering the light of the full moon, which illuminated a cloudless sky. The mutineers made a rush at the barrack room and seized on the muskets and fusées in the racks. Their leader, Daga, and a daring Yaraba named Ogston, instantly charged their pieces. The former of these had a quantity of ball cartridges, loose powder, and ounce-and pistol balls in a kind of grey worsted cap. He must have provided himself with these before the mutiny. How he came possessed of them, especially the pistol balls, I never could learn. Probably he was supplied by his unmilitary countrymen. Pistol balls are never given to infantry. Previous to this, Darga and 3 others made a rush at the regimental storeroom, in which was deposited a quantity of powder. An old African soldier named Charles Dixon interfered to stop them, on which Maurice Ogston, the Yoruba chief, who had armed himself with a sergeant's sword, cut down the faithful African. When down, Darga said in English, "Ah, you old soldier, you knock down." Dixon was not Darga's countryman, hence he could not speak to him in his own language. The pow-pow then levelled his musket and shot the fallen soldier, who groaned and died. The war yells, or rather growls, of the pow-pows and Yorubas now became awfully thrilling, as they helped themselves to cartridges. Most of them were fortunately blank or without balls. Never was a premeditated mutiny so wild and ill-planned. Their chief, Darga, and Ogston seemed to have had little command of the subordinates, and the whole acted more like a set of wild beasts who had broken their cages than men resolved on war. At this period, had a rush been made at the officers' quarters by one half, they were many more than 200 in number, and the other half surrounded the building, not one could have escaped. Instead of this, they continued to shout their war song and howl their war notes. They loaded their pieces with ball cartridge, or blank cartridge, and small stones, and commenced firing at the long range of white buildings in which Colonel Bush and his officers slept. They wasted so much ammunition on their useless display of fury that their buildings were completely riddled. A few of the old soldiers opposed them and were wounded, but it fortunately happened that they were, to an inconceivable degree, ignorant of the right use of firearms, holding their muskets in their hands when they discharged them, without allowing the butt ends to rest against their shoulders or any part of their bodies. This fact accounts for the comparatively little mischief they did in proportion to the quantity of ammunition thrown away. The officers and Sergeant Major escaped at the back of the building, while Colonel Bush and Adjutant Bentley came down a little hill. The colonel commanded the mutineers to lay down their arms, and was answered by an irregular discharge of balls, which rattled among the leaves of a tree under which he and the adjutant were standing. On this, Colonel Bush desired Mr. Bentley to make the best of his way to St. James Barracks for all the disposable force of the 89th Regiment. The officers made good their retreat, and the adjutant got into the stable where his horse was. He saddled and bridled the animal while the shots were coming into the stable, without either man or beast getting injured. The officer mounted, but had to make his way through the mutineers before he could get to San Josef, the barracks standing on an eminence above the little town. On seeing the adjutant mounted, the mutineers set up a thrilling howl and commenced firing at him. He discerned the gigantic figure of Darga, alias Donald Stewart, with his musket at the trail. He spurred his horse through the midst of them. They were grouped, but not in line. On looking back, he saw Darga aiming at him. He stooped his head beside his horse's neck and effectually sheltered himself from about 50 shots aimed at him. In this position he rode furiously down a steep hill leading from the barracks to the church, and was out of danger. His escape appears extraordinary, but he got safe to town and thence to St. James's, and in a short time considering it is 11 miles distance, brought out a strong detachment of European troops. These, however, did not arrive until the affair was over. In the meantime, a part of the officers' quarters was bravely defended by 2 old African soldiers, Sergeant Merry and Corporal Plague. The latter stood in the gallery, near the room in which were the colours. He was ineffectually fired at by some hundreds, yet he kept his post, shot 2 of the mutineers, and, it is said, wounded a 3rd. Such is the difference between a man acquainted with the use of firearms and those who handle them as mops are held. In the meantime, Colonel Bush got to a police station above the barracks and got muskets and a few cartridges from a discharged African soldier who was in the police establishment. Being joined by the policeman, Corporal Craven and Ensign Pogson, they concealed themselves on an eminence above, and as the mutineers, about 100 in number, approached, the fire of the muskets opened on them from the little ambush. The little party fired separately, loading as fast as they discharged their pieces. They succeeded in making the mutineers change their route. It is wonderful what little courage the savages in general showed against the colonel and his little party, who absolutely beat them, although but a 25th of their number, and at their own tactics, i.e. bushfighting. A body of the mutineers now made towards the road to Maracas, when the colonel and his 3 assistants contrived to get behind a silk cotton tree and recommenced firing on them. The Africans hesitated and set forward when the little party continued to fire on them. They set up a yell and retreated down the hill. A part of the mutineers now concealed themselves in the bushes about San Josef barracks. These men, after the affair was over, joined Colonel Bush, and with a mixture of cunning and effrontery, smiled as though nothing had happened, and as though they were glad to see him, although in general they each had several shirts and pairs of trousers on, preparatory for the start to Guinea by way of Band de l'Est. In the meantime, the San Josef militia were assembled to the number of 40. Major Giuseppe and Captain and Adjutant Russo of the 2nd Division of Militia Forces took command of them. They were in want of flints, powder and balls. To obtain these they were obliged to break open a merchant's store. However, the adjutant so judiciously distributed his little force as to hinder the mutineers from entering the town or obtaining access to the militia arsenal, wherein there was a quantity of arms. Major Chads and several old African soldiers joined the militia, and were by them supplied with arms. A good deal of skirmishing occurred between the militia and detached parties of the mutineers, which uniformly ended in the defeat of the latter. At length Daga appeared to the right of a party of 6 at the entrance of the town. They were challenged by the militia, and the mutineers fired on them, but without effect. Only 2 of the militia returned the fire, when all but Daga fled. He was deliberately reloading his piece when a militiaman named Edmund Luce leapt on the gigantic chief, who would have easily beat him off, although the former was a strong young man of colour. But Daga would not let go his gun, and in common with all the mutineers he seemed to have no idea of the use of the bayonet. Daga was dragging the militiaman away when Adjutant Russo came to his assistance and placed a sword to Daga's breast. Dr. Tardy and several others rushed on the tall Negro, who was soon, by the united efforts of several, thrown down and secured. It was at this period that he repeatedly exclaimed, while he bit his own shoulder, "The first white man I catch after this, I will eat him." Meanwhile, about 16 of the mutineers, led by the daring Ogston, took the road to Naporima in order, as they said, to commence their march to Guinea. But fortunately the militia of that village, composed principally of Spaniards, Indians and Sambos, assembled. A few of these met them and stopped their march. A kind of parley, if intercourse carried on by signs could be so called, was carried on between the parties. The mutineers made signs that they wished to go forward, while the few militiamen endeavoured to detain them, expecting a reinforcement momently. After a time, the militia agreed to allow them to approach the town. As they were advancing, they were met by the commandant, Martin Sorzano, Esquire, with 16 more militiamen. The commandant judged it imprudent to allow the Africans to enter the town with their muskets full cocked and poised ready to fire. An interpreter was now procured, and the mutineers were told that if they would retire to their barracks, the gentlemen present would intercede for their pardon. The negroes refused to accede to these terms, and while the interpreter was addressing some, the rest tried to push forward. Some of the militia opposed them by holding their muskets in a horizontal position, on which one of the mutineers fired, and the militia returned the fire. A melee commenced in which 14 mutineers were killed and wounded. The fire of the Africans produced little effect. They soon took to flight amid the woods which flanked the road. 28 of them were taken, amongst whom was the Yaraba chief Ogston. 6 had been killed and 6 committed suicide by strangling and hanging themselves in the woods. Only 1 man was wounded among the militia, and he but slightly, from a small stone fired from a musket of one of the Yarabas. The quantity of ammunition expended by the mutineers and the comparatively little mischief done by them was truly astonishing. It showed how little they understood the use of firearms. Dixon was killed and several of the old African soldiers were wounded, but not one of the officers was in the slightest degree hurt. I have never been able to get a correct account of the number of lives this wild mutiny cost, but believe it was not less than 40, including those slain by the militia at Naporima, those shot at San Josef, those who died of their wounds, and most of the wounded men died, the 6 who committed suicide, the 3 that were shot by sentence of the court-martial, and 1 who was shot while endeavouring to escape, Satchel. A good-looking young man named Torrens was brought as prisoner to the presence of Colonel Bush. The colonel wished to speak to him, and desired his guards to liberate him, on which the young savage shook his sleeve, in which was concealed a razor, made a rush at the colonel, and nearly succeeded in cutting his throat. He slashed the razor in all directions until he made an opening. He rushed through this, and notwithstanding he was fired at, and I believe wounded, he effected his escape, was subsequently retaken, and again made his escape with Satchel, who after this was shot by a policeman. Torrens was retaken, tried and recommended to mercy. Of this man's fate I am unable to speak, not knowing how far the recommendation to mercy was attended to. In appearance he seemed the mildest and best looking of the mutineers, but his conduct was one of the most ferocious of any. The whole of the mutineers were captured within 1 week of the mutiny, save for this man, who was taken a month after. On the 19th of July, Donald Stewart, otherwise Darga, was brought to a court-martial. On the 21st, William Satchel was tried. On the 22nd, a court-martial was held on Edward Coffin, and on the 24th, one was held on the Yaraba chief Maurice Ogston, whose country's name was I believe, Marwi. Torrens was tried on the 29th. The sentences of these courts-martial were unknown until the 14th of August, having been sent to Barbados in order to be submitted to the Commander-in-Chief, Lieutenant General Whittingham, who approved of the decision of the courts, which was that Donald Stewart, Darga, Maurice Ogston, and Edward Coffin should suffer death by being shot, and that William Satchell should be transported beyond seas during the term of his natural life. I am unacquainted with the sentence of Torrens. Donald Stewart, Maurice Ogston, and Edward Coffin were executed on the 16th of August 1837 at San Josef barracks. Nothing seemed to have been neglected which could render the execution solemn and impressive. The scenery and the weather gave additional awe to the melancholy proceedings. Fronting the little eminence where the prisoners were shot was the scene where their ill-concerted mutiny commenced. To the right stood the long range of buildings on which they had expended so much of their ammunition for the purpose of destroying their officers. The rest of the panorama was made up of an immense view of forest below them, and upright masses of mountains above them. Over those, heavy bodies of mist were slowly sailing, giving a sombre appearance to the primeval woods which, in general, covered both mountains and plains. The atmosphere indicated an intertropical morning during the rainy season, and the sun shone resplendently between dense columns of clouds. At 7:30 o'clock, the condemned men asked to be allowed to eat a hearty meal, as they said persons about to be executed in Guinea were always indulged with a good repast. It is remarkable that these unhappy creatures ate most voraciously, even while they were being brought out of their cell for execution. A little before the mournful procession commenced, the condemned men were dressed from head to foot in white habiliments trimmed with black. Their arms were bound with cords. This is not usual in military executions, but was deemed necessary on the present occasion. An attempt to escape on the part of the condemned would have been productive of much confusion and was properly guarded against. The condemned men displayed no unmanly fear. On the contrary, they steadily kept step to the Dead March which the band played. Yet the certainty of death threw a cadaverous and ghastly hue over their black features, while their singular and appropriate costume and the 3 coffins being borne before them altogether rendered it a frightful picture. Hence it was not to be wondered at that 2 of the European soldiers fainted. The mutineers marched abreast. The tall form and horrid looks of Darga were almost appalling. The looks of Ogston were sullen, calm and determined, and those of Coffin seemed to indicate resignation. At 8 o'clock they arrived at the spot where the 3 graves were dug. Here their coffins were deposited. The condemned men were made to face to westward. 3 sides of a hollow square were formed, flanked on one side by a detachment of the 89th Regiment and a party of artillery, while the recruits, many of whom shared the guilt of the culprits, were appropriately placed in the line opposite them. The firing party were a little in advance of the recruits. The sentence of the courts-martial and other necessary documents having been read by the fort adjutant, Mr. Meehan, the chaplain of the forces read some prayers appropriated for these melancholy occasions. The clergyman then shook hands with the 3 men about to be sent into another state of existence. Darga and Ogston coolly gave their hands. Coffin wrung the chaplain's hand affectionately, saying in tolerable English, "I am now done with this world." The arms of the condemned men, as had been before stated, were bound, but in such a manner as to allow them to bring their hands to their heads. Their nightcaps were drawn over their eyes. Coffin allowed his to remain, but Ogston and Darga pushed theirs up again. The former did this calmly. The latter showed great wrath, seeming to think himself insulted, and his deep metallic voice sounded in anger above that of the Provost Marshal, as the latter gave the words, "Ready, present." But at this instant the vociferous daring forsook him. As the men levelled their muskets at him, with inconceivable rapidity he sprang bodily round, still preserving his squatting posture, and received the fire from behind, while the less noisy but more brave Ogston looked at the firing party full in the face as they discharged their fatal volley. In one instant all three fell dead, almost all the balls of the firing party having taken effect. The savage appearance and manner of Darga excited awe. Admiration was felt for the calm bravery of Ogston, while Edward Coffin's fate excited commiseration. There were many spectators of this dreadful scene, and among others a great concourse of negroes. Most of these expressed their hopes that after this terrible example the recruits would make good soldiers. Ah, stupid savages! Yes, but also, ah, stupid civilized people! Chapter 10. Naporima and Montserrat. I had a few days of pleasant wandering in the centre of the island, about the districts which bear the name of Naporima and Montserrat, a country of such extraordinary fertility as well as beauty, that it must surely hereafter become the seat of a high civilization. The soil seems inexhaustibly rich. I say inexhaustibly, for as fast as the upper layer is impoverished, it will be swept over by the tropic rains to mingle with the Vegas or alluvial flats below, and thus enriched again, while a fresh layer of virgin soil is exposed above. I have seen, cresting the highland ridges of Montserrat, 10 feet at least of fat earth, falling clod by clod right and left upon the gardens below. There are, doubtless, comparatively barren tracts of gravel towards the northern mountains. There are poor, sandy lands likewise at the southern part of the island, which are said, nevertheless, to be specially fitted for the growth of cotton. But from San Fernando on the west coast to Manzanilla on the east stretches a band of soil which seems to be capable of yielding any conceivable return to labour and capital, not omitting common sense. How long has it taken to prepare this natural garden for man is one of those questions of geological time for which have been well called of late appalling. How long was it since the older Parian rocks, said to belong to the Neocomian or green sand era of Pointe-à-Pierre, were laid down at the bottom of the sea? How long since a still unknown thickness of tertiary strata in the Nariva district laid down on them? How long since not less than 6,000 feet of still later tertiary strata laid down on them again? What vast, though probably slow, processes changed that sea bottom from one salt enough to carry corals and limestones to one brackish enough to carry abundant remains of plants, deposited probably by the Orinoco or by some river which then did duty for it. 3 such periods of disturbance have been distinguished, the net result of which is that the strata comparatively recent in geological time have fractured, tilted, even set upright on end over the whole lowland. Trinidad seems to have had its full share of those later disturbances of the earth crust, which carried tertiary strata up along the shoulders of the Alps, which upheaved the chalk of the Isle of Wight, setting the tertiary beds of Alum Bay upright against it, which even after the age of ice thrust up the Isle of Moon in Denmark and the Isle of Ely in Cambridgeshire, entangling the boulder clay among the chalk. How long ago? Long enough ago, in Trinidad at least, to allow water, probably the estuary waters of the Orinoco, to saw all the upheaved layers off at the top into one flat sea bottom once more, leaving as projections certain harder knots of rock, such as the limestones of Mount Tamana, and, it may be, the curious knoll of hard clay rock under which nestles the town of San Fernando. Long enough ago also to allow that whole sea bottom to be lifted up once more to the height in one spot of 1,000 feet, as the lowland which occupies 6/7 of the Isle of Trinidad. Long enough ago again to allow that lowland to be sawn out into hills and valleys, ridges and gullies, which are due to the action of Colonel George Greenwood's geologic panacea, rain and rivers, and to nothing else. Long enough ago once more for a period of subsidence, as I suspect, to follow the period of upheaval, a period at the commencement of which Trinidad was perhaps several times as large as it is now, and has gradually been eaten away by the surf, as fresh pieces of the soft cliffs have been brought by the sinking of the land face to face with its slow but sure destroyer. And how long ago began the epoch, the very latest of which this globe has seen, which has been long enough for all this? The human imagination can no more grasp that time than it can grasp the space between us and the nearest star. Such thoughts were forced upon me as the steamer stopped off San Fernando, and I saw, some quarter of a mile out to sea, a single stack of rock, which is said to have been joined to the mainland in the memory of the fathers of this generation, and on shore, composed, I am told, of the same rock, that hill of San Fernando which forms a beacon by sea and land for many a mile around. An isolated boss of the older Parian, composed of hardened clay, which has escaped destruction. It rises, though not a mile long and 1/3 of a mile broad, steeply to a height of nearly 600 feet, carrying on its cliffs the remains of a once magnificent vegetation. Now its sides are quarried for the only roadstone met with for miles around, cultivated for pasture, in which the round-headed mango trees grow about like oaks at home, or terraced for villas and gardens, the charm of which cannot be told in words. All round it sugar estates spread out, with the noble palmistes left standing here and there along the roads and terraces, and everywhere is activity and high cultivation, under the superintendence of gentlemen who are prospering because they deserve to prosper. Between the cliffs and the shore nestles the gay and growing little town, which was, when we took the island in 1795, only a group of huts. In it I noted only one thing which looked unpleasant. The negro houses, however roomy and comfortable, and however rich the gardens which surrounded them, were mostly patched together out of the most heterogeneous and wretched scraps of wood, and on inquiry I found that the materials were, in most cases, stolen, that when a negro wanted to build a house, instead of buying the materials, he pilfered a board here, a stick there, a nail somewhere else, a lock or a clamp in a fourth place, about the sugar estates, regardless of the serious injury which he caused to working buildings, and when he had gathered a sufficient pile, hidden safely away behind his neighbour's house, the new hut rose as if by magic. This continual pilfering, I was assured, was a serious tax on the cultivation of the estates around, but I was told too, frankly enough, by the very gentleman who complained, that this habit was simply an heirloom of the bad days of slavery, when the pilfering of the slaves from other estates was connived at by their own masters, on the ground that if A's negro robbed B, B's negroes robbed C, and so all round the alphabet. One more evil instance of the demoralizing effect of a state of things which, wrong in itself, was sure to be the parent of 100 other wrongs. Being, happily for me, in the governor's suite, I had opportunities of seeing the interior of the island which an average traveller could not have, and I looked forward with interest to visiting new settlements in the forests of the interior, which very few inhabitants of the island, and certainly no strangers, had yet seen. Our journey began by landing on a good new jetty, and being transferred at once to the tramway which adjoined it. A truck with chairs on it, as usual here, carried us off at a good mule trot, and we ran in the fast-fading light through a rolling, hummocky country, very like the lowlands of Aberdeenshire, or the neighbourhood of Waterloo, save that, as night came on, the fireflies flickered everywhere among the canes, and here and there the palms and cebus stood up, black and gaunt against the sky. At last we escaped from our truck and found horses waiting, on which we floundered, through mud and moonlight, to a certain hospitable house, and found a hungry party who had been long waiting for a dinner worth the waiting. It was not until next morning that I found into what a charming place I had entered overnight. Around were books, pictures, china, vases of flowers, works of art, and all appliances of European taste, even luxury, but in a house utterly un-European. The living rooms, all on the first floor, opened into each other by doorless doorways, and the walls were of cedar and other valuable woods, which good taste had left still unpapered. Windowless bay windows like great portholes opened from each of them into a gallery, which ran round the house, sheltered by broad sloping eaves. The deep shade of the eaves contrasted brilliantly with the bright light outside, and contrasted too with the wooden pillars which held up the roof, and which seemed on the southern sides white hot in the blazing sunshine. What a field was there for native art, for richest ornamentation of those pillars and those beams! Surely Trinidad and the whole of northern South America ought to become some day the paradise of wood carvers, who, copying even a few of the numberless vegetable and animal forms around, may far surpass the old wood-carving schools of Burma and Hindustan. And as I sat dreaming of the lianes which might be made to wreathe the pillars, the flowers, fruits, birds, butterflies, monkeys, kinkajous, and what not, which might cluster about the capitals or swing along the beams, let men who have such materials and such models proscribe all tawdry and poor European art, most of it a bad imitation of bad Greek, or worse, Renaissance, and trust to nature and the facts which lie nearest